The puppy was abandoned in the freezing, snowy forest, with a pack of wolves closing in. Just as death seemed inevitable, a dark figure appeared, silent, without a bark or growl, simply standing between the pup and danger. Why would an old dog, scarred and weathered, risk everything to save a stranger? And what made a solitary man, living deep in the woods, choose to open his arms to them both? Now back to the story. The forest didn't care who lived or died. Its trees stood tall and indifferent, cloaked in snow so thick it muffled every sound but the distant howl of wind. Beneath a fallen pine, barely visible against the frozen earth, a small German shepherd puppy lay curled in on himself. His ribs, too sharp for his young body, rose and fell in shallow gasps. He had no name, no direction, only the memory of warmth that now felt like a cruel dream. He had been left behind. He didn't know why. Days had passed since the last familiar scent disappeared. Hunger gnawed at him like the cold, merciless and constant. His paws, once clumsy but full of energy, now twitched weakly when he tried to stand. The wind cut through his thin coat as night crept in, turning the sky a deep, endless blue. He watched the moon rise through shaking eyes, not with wonder but with quiet dread. It was the only thing that seemed to witness his slow fading, and it offered no comfort. Then came the sound. At first, it was just a whisper of movement, barely noticeable between the gusts. Then another, closer, a low crack of branches breaking beneath careful weight. The puppy froze. His ears twitched, but his body couldn't follow. He tried to crawl deeper beneath the log, but his muscles betrayed him. Eyes, glowing, more than one pair. From the shadows between the trees, sleek forms moved like smoke, silent, certain, and hungry. Wolves. Their scent hit him like a wave, wild, thick, and electric. Every hair along his back stood on end. His heart thudded so hard he thought it might break. One of them stepped forward, lips curled back, golden eyes locked on him with no mercy. He wanted to run, to scream, but his legs trembled and folded beneath him. He was too tired, too broken. This, he knew, was the end. And just as the circle began to close, just as the breath caught in his throat and the world shrank into fear, something else moved in the dark. Something bigger, something that didn't run, something that stood between him and death. The wolves hesitated. From the darkness beyond the clearing, another presence stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and unafraid. It wasn't one of them. Its scent was different, earthy, metallic, tinged with smoke and old wounds. Not predator, but not prey either. A German shepherd, full-grown. His coat was a patchwork of black and tan, dulled by weather and streaked with grime. Scar tissue mapped his frame like forgotten battlefields. His eyes, dark and heavy, carried the weight of many winters. He didn't growl, not at first. He simply stood between the wolves and the dying puppy, his breath fogging the air in slow, steady clouds. The wolves shifted uneasily. They knew the language of strength, and this animal spoke it fluently. His posture was calm but ready, every muscle taut beneath the cold. He made no move to attack, yet something in his stance warned, not today. The alpha wolf, taller, broader, his fur bristling with power, lowered his head and met the shepherd's gaze. The forest fell into a hush, broken only by the whispering snow. The two stared at each other for what felt like hours, though only seconds passed. One was the shadow of the wild, the other the shadow of a world left behind. The shepherd took a single step forward. The wolves understood. This would not be easy, and easy was what they preferred. Without sound, the alpha gave the signal, a twitch of muscle, a flick of ear. One by one, the wolves peeled back into the trees, vanishing into the snow as if they had never been there. The last to go was the alpha, his golden eyes lingering, burning into the memory of the one who stood firm. Then he was gone. Silence returned, thick and heavy. The puppy remained where he was, his breathing ragged, his body curled into a trembling knot. He hadn't moved, not out of strategy, but because he couldn't. His limbs refused, his heartbeat hadn't yet slowed. The shepherd approached, slowly, carefully, no sudden movements. He sniffed the puppy gently, a low rumble rising in his chest. Not aggression, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. He lowered himself beside the pup, folding his worn body into a protective curve. His warmth spilled into the frozen air like a blanket. He didn't nudge. He didn't bark. He simply stayed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the puppy felt something other than fear. He felt presence. He felt not alone. The snow began to fall again, thicker, softer this time. The log above them shielded most of the wind, and the body beside him radiated a heat that his own could no longer make. The shepherd exhaled, slow and deep, and the puppy, drawn by some fragile instinct, nestled closer. It didn't make sense. Not yet. He didn't know who this dog was or why he had chosen to help. The world had taught him not to expect kindness. But here, in this moment, warmth and breath and protection were real. Night dragged on. The shepherd didn't sleep, but the puppy drifted, not fully resting, not quite awake. Between half-dreams and waking shivers, he clung to the steady rhythm of the older dog's breathing. The darkness no longer held only danger. It now held something else, the unknown shape of hope. By morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight, pale and indifferent, filtered through the trees. The air still stung, but it no longer howled. The shepherd rose slowly, every joint creaking with effort. He took a few steps toward the trees, then paused and turned, glancing back. The puppy watched. Panic flickered inside him. Was this it? Was the protector leaving? He tried to stand, but his legs collapsed beneath him again. He whimpered, not by choice, but from frustration, from fear. He had no voice left to beg, but the shepherd didn't disappear. Moments later, he returned, his jaws gripping something dark and heavy. He dropped it gently in front of the puppy, meat, still warm, stripped from some unseen kill. The scent flooded the pup's senses like fire in his veins. Starving, shivering, he devoured it clumsily, his whole body shaking with each bite. The shepherd watched, unmoving, not judging, not rushing, just watching. When the last scrap vanished, the puppy's body slumped to the ground again, exhausted, but fed. The shepherd lay down beside him once more, this time closer. The puppy, too weak to question it, pressed his small form against the larger one. And in that stillness, something settled. The night hadn't taken him. The wolves hadn't ended him. And the cold, for all its sharpness, had not been the only force at work in the woods. That day, a bond was born, without words, without promises. A choice had been made. And somehow in the heart of a frozen forest, the tiniest flicker of trust began to burn. The days that followed blurred together beneath a veil of snow and silence. The forest offered no paths, only choices. The puppy walked them not alone, but beside the one who had stood between him and death. The older shepherd moved with a quiet grace, each step purposeful, each pause measured. Though his body bore the weight of years and scars, there was power in the way he led, an understanding of this wild place that came not from instinct, but experience. The puppy followed with effort. His legs, still unsteady, carried him forward in bursts. He stumbled often, but he rose. The cold bit at his ears, at his tail, at his healing ribs. But something deeper now pushed him onward. Not survival, not fear. It was loyalty. They walked until the sky began to dim, and the wind whispered warnings through the pine. The shepherd stopped. He sniffed the air, head tilted slightly, muscles tight. The puppy, sensing the shift, halted as well. He didn't know what to look for, but he knew what silence meant. Birds had vanished. Even the trees seemed to brace themselves. The shepherd turned his gaze toward the shadows between the trees. They were not alone. The darkness had come back. At first it was movement, barely perceptible, a flicker, a breath. Then eyes emerged again, cold, golden, familiar. The wolves had returned, but this time they didn't rush. They circled, slowly, calculating. They had not forgotten the defiance of the shepherd, nor the lost prey that had slipped through their jaws. The air thickened with threat. The snow beneath the dog's paws held its breath. The shepherd stood still. He did not run. The puppy pressed against him, heart hammering. The heat of his protector's body reminded him that he wasn't alone, but it did little to still the tremble in his legs. Every instinct screamed for flight, but something else whispered, "Stay." The alpha stepped forward again, larger than before in the dying light, his fur bristling with hunger and resolve. This wasn't curiosity now, this was retribution. Still, the shepherd didn't move, not one step. He growled, not loudly, not for show. It was deep, primal. The sound of a creature who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to defend. The wolves closed in. The tension coiled tighter. The alpha began to circle, eyes never breaking from the shepherd's. The others mirrored him, fluid, patient, dangerous. They would not make the same mistake. They would overwhelm, smother, end it. And then the alpha lunged. The movement was sudden, violent, grey fur and teeth flashing like lightning. But the shepherd met him mid-air, jaws clashing in a blur of motion and snow. They crashed to the ground with a force that shook the stillness. The forest erupted into chaos. The other wolves moved. The puppy froze, watching the older dog locked in a brutal tangle with the alpha. Snarls and the thud of bodies filled the clearing. Blood sprayed across snow. It wasn't a fight. It was survival carved into flesh. And then he realized more were coming. Two wolves peeled from the edge, eyes now on him. Smaller, weaker, an easier kill. He couldn't run, not because he didn't want to, but because the thought of leaving that dog behind was more terrifying than the claws closing in. So he did the unthinkable. He barked. It was barely a sound, a scratch of defiance. But it was enough. The wolves looked at him, and one charged. Time slowed. The puppy saw the beast coming, felt his own body locked in place, his limbs refusing to move. He was going to die. The memory of warmth, of protection, of hope. It would all end in this one moment. But then a shadow flew across his vision. The older shepherd, bloodied, limping, threw himself into the charging wolf, knocking it off course with a roar that seemed to shake the trees. The impact sent them tumbling through the snow. He rose again, between the puppy and the threat, chest heaving, legs quivering. He wasn't fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for him. But there were too many. The wolves regrouped, spreading like wildfire. The shepherd's breaths came harder now, his strength fading. The puppy could see it in the way he staggered, in the way his shoulders sagged beneath invisible weight. This would be the end. Until a new sound cracked through the trees. A single gunshot. Sharp, echoing. The forest froze. Wolves stopped mid-step. The sound meant something ancient, danger, death. Another figure had entered the clearing, tall, wrapped in heavy clothes, with snow-dusted boots and a rifle still raised. A man. The wolves didn't wait. As one, they turned and vanished into the woods, tails low, hearts racing. Silence fell again. The shepherd collapsed, and the puppy, trembling from head to tail, rushed to his side. The man approached cautiously, kneeling beside the wounded dog. The shepherd's chest still moved, barely. The man's hand, rough but gentle, touched his side. He was alive, but only just. The puppy looked at the man, unsure. His body screamed to run, but his heart wouldn't let him. He had already chosen where he belonged, and it was here, beside the dog who didn't leave him, beside the one who fought when no one else would, beside the only soul who had ever stood between him and the dark. The man stood over the fallen dog, rifle lowered, breath visible in the cold morning air. His coat was worn, edges frayed from years of weather and silence. Snow clung to his boots like the past clung to his shoulders, heavy, unshakable. He had come to this place long ago to escape noise, but now stood amid a scene that spoke louder than any voice. He knelt, slowly, beside the shepherd. The dog's side rose and fell in uneven rhythm. Dried blood streaked his coat, and beneath the fur, fresh wounds throbbed against the cold. Yet, even now, even broken and beaten, the dog didn't growl. He simply met the man's gaze with eyes dulled by pain, but sharp with recognition. The man reached out, hesitant. Not because he feared the dog, but because he feared what this moment meant. He touched the shepherd gently along the ribs, his fingers finding old scars and new injuries alike. A quiet sigh escaped him, part relief, part regret. Then he turned to the puppy who stood nearby, chest heaving, eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. He looked so small in the snow, no collar, no tag, only ribs and trembling paws and a loyalty far too big for his body. The man didn't speak, not yet. Words had lost their edge years ago. Instead, he moved with purpose. He set the rifle aside, shrugged off his pack, and pulled out a roll of cloth and a tin of antiseptic. The shepherd didn't flinch as the man cleaned the wounds. He winced, yes, his body tensing with each sting. But he did not pull away. He remembered the scent of this man, the feel of these hands. The puppy watched it all. He didn't understand what passed between them, only that something had, something important. So he stayed close. He didn't run. He didn't whimper. He simply waited. When the last bandage was tied, the man sat back on his heels, exhaling hard. His eyes lingered on the shepherd's face, searching. Then, without warning, he leaned forward, resting a hand lightly on the dog's head. "I found you," he whispered, not to be heard, but to make it real. The shepherd's eyes fluttered closed for a moment. The puppy moved closer and curled up beside the older dog, pressing his small body against the bandaged flank. It was instinct, not caution, not fear, just belonging. The man watched them both, and then, after a long pause, he nodded to no one and stood. He lifted the shepherd into his arms. The weight nearly buckled him. This was no small dog, and the years had not been kind to the man's joints. But he didn't waver. He simply adjusted the burden and began to walk. The puppy scrambled after him. He had no plan, no map, only a single truth carved deep into his chest. Where the shepherd went, he would follow. The trek was long. The snow had thickened during the fight, and each step forward left a deep print behind. The man's breathing grew harder with every hill. The puppy trailed close behind, weaving through the footprints, his legs moving faster to keep up. The world was white and endless, but the man did not stop, not until a shape emerged ahead. A cabin, low and wooden, slouched against the trees like it belonged there. Smoke curled from a chimney. The door creaked on its hinges. It wasn't much, but it was something more powerful than walls and roof. It was shelter. Inside, warmth greeted them. A fire burned in the hearth, its glow reaching across the floor like sunlight on still water. The man lowered the shepherd onto a thick wool blanket near the fire. The dog groaned faintly, but did not resist. The puppy followed, sniffing the floor, the air, the edges of this strange place. He paused beside the shepherd, then curled up tightly against him once more. The man watched, silent again. Then, without drama, he moved into the kitchen. A pot clinked. Water hissed over flame. Minutes passed. When he returned, he carried 2 bowls, one smaller, one heavy and deep. He set them down. Warm broth, pieces of meat, food that smelled like safety. The puppy ate first, frantic and grateful. When he finished, he looked up, licking his lips. The man didn't scold. He simply nudged the larger bowl toward the shepherd, and the shepherd, slow and tired, lifted his head and ate. The man smiled faintly. It wasn't joy, it wasn't relief. It was something quieter, the look of a man who thought he'd lost something, only to find it again in the most unlikely way. As the fire crackled, the man sat in an old wooden chair. The dogs slept, one healing, one learning what it meant to feel safe. Outside, snow fell again, soft and silent. Inside, no words were spoken. None were needed. The forest had given them to each other. And for the first time in a long time, the lonely man wasn't alone. The wind howled through the trees that night, pressing against the cabin like a memory trying to find its way back inside. But inside, it was quiet. The shepherd lay curled on the thick blanket, his breathing shallow but steady. The puppy had nestled tightly against him, their bodies joined not by blood, but by a bond stronger than either understood. The fire in the hearth cracked and popped, casting a soft orange glow across the wooden walls. It was the first warmth the puppy had felt that didn't come from another body. It smelled of cedar and smoke, and it seeped into his fur like a gentle promise. "You're safe." The man sat nearby, hunched over, arms resting on his knees. He hadn't spoken since they arrived. He hadn't needed to. His eyes did enough. They moved between the shepherd and the puppy, reading stories only he seemed to remember. He rose once, slow and deliberate, and rummaged through an old storage chest tucked in the corner. From it, he pulled a small wooden box wrapped in a canvas cloth. He carried it back to the fire and sat again, turning it over in his hands. The box creaked open, its hinges stiff with time. Inside, folded carefully, was a photograph. The man held it for a long moment, letting the firelight reveal its faded edges. In the picture, a younger version of himself knelt beside a German shepherd. Strong, noble, proud. The background showed mountains and snow. The dog's eyes were sharp but not cold. They were loyal. The same eyes now lay closed beside the fire. He didn't speak the name. Not yet. Saying it felt like waking something sacred. But he looked at the shepherd with the soft ache of recognition, of reunion. The puppy shifted, disturbed by some dream, then settled again. The man watched him closely now. His ribs no longer jutted like broken branches. His breathing, once frantic, had found a rhythm. He was still thin, still fragile, but alive. Alive because of the one who had once belonged to him and had found his way back. Later that night, as the wind died down and snowflakes tapped gently against the window pane, the man moved again. He laid a second blanket over the dogs, careful not to disturb them. Then he sat beside them, legs crossed on the floor, resting his back against the wall. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe he was afraid to leave them alone. Maybe he just didn't want to be across the room. The minutes passed quietly. The fire dimmed, the cabin darkened. Somewhere in the stillness, the shepherd opened one eye. He turned his head, slow, heavy, and for the first time since the wolves, he reached out with his muzzle and touched the puppy's head, a gentle brush, brief and instinctive. The puppy stirred, pressed closer, and let out a soft sigh. The man saw it all. No words, just that quiet exchange, a gesture older than language, deeper than any command. It was permission. It was peace. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He had come to this cabin years ago after losing everything that mattered. He had built it not as a home, but as a shelter, a place to disappear. But now the floor felt warmer, the silence less empty. The shadows on the walls didn't look so sharp anymore. In the morning he rose early. The sun filtered in through the frosted windows, weak but golden. The world outside was still buried in white, but inside something had changed. The man brewed coffee over the stove, its scent wrapping through the room like something familiar and long missed. He laid out food again. The shepherd rose to eat, slowly, cautiously, but with more strength than the night before. His eyes held alertness now, the dullness fading like mist in daylight. The puppy followed, eating eagerly, glancing at the man, then at the shepherd, as if waiting for someone to tell him he was allowed to stay. No one did. No one needed to. After breakfast, the man fetched an old collar from a drawer. It was faded, scratched, but still intact. He sat beside the shepherd, running a hand through the dog's fur, now clean and soft under the fire's heat. Then, without ceremony, he slipped the collar around his neck. The shepherd didn't resist. The man smiled, a brief, weathered thing. Later, when the sun climbed higher and the snow outside softened into quiet drifts, the man stood, looked down at the two dogs, and said what had been true for days now, even if unspoken. "You're home." The puppy didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He wagged his tail, just once, then walked to the man and leaned against his leg. The fire crackled behind them. And for the first time in his short, cold life, the puppy didn't have to run from the night. He had already found the fire that would carry him through it. The days that followed unfolded like pages from a forgotten book, quiet, deliberate, and full of healing. Outside, the snow never stopped falling. It cloaked the forest in white silence, burying every broken trail and half-forgotten path. But inside the cabin, warmth lingered in more than the fire. It lived in the rhythm of shared breath, in the weight of two dogs sleeping side by side, in the soft creak of floorboards under steady footsteps. The shepherd healed. He still limped, but his eyes were clear now, his chest full. When the man entered the room, he lifted his head, not in defense, but in quiet recognition. There was no need for commands. Trust had grown, not through training, but through time. The puppy, smaller but no longer fragile, shadowed every movement. He sniffed corners, followed Boots, sat at the edge of the porch with ears perked toward the forest. But every night, without fail, he returned to the shepherd's side. There he found the peace he had once believed impossible. One morning the man took them both outside. The sun was weak but present, spilling light across the snow like a quiet revelation. The shepherd walked ahead, slow but proud. The puppy bounded behind, his tail a blur of joy. The man watched them with something unspoken etched into the lines of his face. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tag. On it, engraved by hand, was a name: Shadow. He knelt, fastened it to the puppy's collar, and stepped back. The shepherd, Max, stood still, watching. Then, with deliberate grace, he lowered his head and pressed his muzzle gently against Shadow's. It was a blessing. It was acceptance. And it was enough. As they turned back toward the cabin, 3 shadows moved through the snow, one limping, one bounding, and one standing steady. Behind them, the forest remained cold and wide, but in front of them a cabin waited, lit by fire and filled with something that once seemed lost. Not survival, not safety, home. And I learned then, family isn't always who we're born to. Sometimes it's who finds us in the snow and chooses to stay.